Okay, we got a good turnout. Well, thank you everyone for showing up, and we'll have three different papers, each of about 12 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A. So my name is Anthony Szilard, and I'll be the first presenter. So I'll go ahead and get started, and then we'll go to Billy and Aaron for our next presentations. So this paper is about post-traumatic growth. I've been doing research on secondary trauma in nonprofit human service organizations for a few years now. And, essentially, as I did a theoretical paper with nonprofit management and leadership. This is kind of a follow-up to that, really looking at, I did interviews with about 41 nonprofit leaders and their team members in organizations around the country, in the United States, so around DC, Maryland, Virginia, and then a number of them in California. And I came upon this. It's interesting because I was noticing, this is a qualitative study. I was noticing in the interviews this phenomenon of that some people really were growing and learning from the trauma they'd experienced and others weren't. And then I came across the post-traumatic growth concept, which was developed about 2.5 decades ago by two UNC psychologists, Tedeschi and Calhoun. I think Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun. And so it's kind of a nice kind of to see through the data what's also been quite a bit of study on in the last few decades. So these were 9 nonprofit organizations, and really looking at the role of post-traumatic growth, it's called PTG, in how secondary trauma is affecting staff in nonprofit human service organizations, and what that means for those organizations. So this is really, at this point, I'm still coding the data, so this is very preliminary, but just to show you guys kind of where it's going. And then of course, we'd love to have any feedback and questions and so forth in the last part of our session today. So for those of you that are not familiar with it, secondary trauma is essentially, think of it like secondhand smoke. It's that if you or an individual is in contact, and especially a protracted interaction with someone experiencing primary trauma. Now, primary trauma is any life-threatening situation. So crime, violence, poverty, rape, illness, natural disaster, right now, COVID, of course, right? So any of these kinds of situations that threaten life produce trauma. Secondary trauma is when a second individual has a sustained interaction with someone experiencing primary or personal trauma, and kind of through emotion contagion effects, they receive some of that trauma. So I've been going around and doing these interviews with all of these nonprofits around around how they experience secondary trauma, and that's where, as we'll see, the post-traumatic growth kind of came out of it. There's very little research on this in the nonprofit research field, and I welcome any of you who are interested to come and join me. I mean, we need a lot more. There's been very little, nothing really in NVSQ. I have the one paper in NML, but very little on how nonprofits regulate and manage trauma. And this is a real oversight, because nonprofits are at the forefront of human tragedy that involves life-threatening situations. And the nonprofit staff and volunteers who are working in those organizations, they think of it like this: like take a coffee cup and fill it right to the brim. And you're managing one of these staff people or volunteers, and they're experiencing all these negative emotions, this sort of constellation of negative emotions that trauma encompasses. And then you want to give someone a hard time for being late or not having the proposal ready. It's like dropping another negative emotion into that coffee cup, and it's going to overflow. And so it's different. Managing, my interest is always emotion and leadership. That's in nonprofit organizations, that's what I do. And if you think about it in these if you have a nonprofit, let's say, that's doing environmental work, where, like, for example, I did interview an organization where they're basically advising Fortune 500 companies on their environmental practices. That's very different than you're working directly, for example, as a counselor with an 8-year-old girl who's been raped by her stepfather, right? And I interviewed that counselor and also her manager. And in that type of situation, when the individual feels that, one, this goes against my values, and two, I don't know how to cope with it, that's where the trauma and other toxic emotions like helplessness, powerlessness kind of ensue. And so this situation, secondary trauma, can be very debilitating. And so in the interviews, I tend to hear a lot of the kind of gloom and doom of all the detrimental effects, the detrimental interpersonal effects that secondary trauma has. And what's kind of interesting is that as I'm doing these interviews, after spending 40 minutes listening to like the stress, the burnout, the weariness of dealing with managers that don't understand what they're going through, which is so common, then I ask the question, so how has the secondary trauma you've experienced benefited you? And it's just like, what? Well, think about your values, the values you had before you started this work and your values now. Have they changed? Do you see, have you noticed any, like, if you think, like, what would be the disadvantage to you if you never had done this work in terms of how your values have crystallized? And then it's just like, it's the pause. And then people start sharing these amazing stories about how they've adapted and evolved and become different people. And this is the post-traumatic growth. And so now we go back to theory. Post-traumatic growth, we give you a little bit here. It's basically when you find benefit in trauma. And it can lead to these positive life changes. Here's kind of a more detailed kind of explanation of some of the things that happen. But basically, people tend to appreciate their relationships more, appreciate life more. They feel more resilient, stronger, find more meaning in life. Don't waste time with those friends that are trivial, right? Spend time more with what brings them meaning. More open to experience. A lot of shift in life priorities and even spirituality. So I'll give you an example. This is not from the study, but this is from one of my previous books. But I interviewed a bus driver in Washington, D.C., Carl, who there was a gang fight on his bus, and he got 3 times. And he shared with me in the interview, he said, I used to be so focused on money and how I looked, and I don't even care about those things anymore. I'm just so grateful to be walking on this beautiful earth that God's given us. Just complete shift. And we've seen in tragedies like 9/11, a lot of people who I interviewed, a lot of folks from that too, who ended up, making huge life changes. We're seeing the same thing with COVID now. Really a realignment of priorities that come from trauma. That is PTG, or post-traumatic growth. So the research question is, how does PTG influence the effects of secondary trauma on nonprofit human service organization staff, as I mentioned? That's really, I will share with you, so I have just a few more minutes. So I'll share with you some of the preliminary findings. So as it turns out, this PTG can be very beneficial for nonprofit organizations. Individuals that work in nonprofits that experience post-traumatic growth, they tend to become more resilient, more able to weather adversity. They also tend, and this is to me one of the most compelling findings, and this is across, I don't even know if I've done an interview where this hasn't come through, where there's a natural empathy that they experience toward other people experiencing trauma. So a natural sense of compassion for people who've gone through similar situations. And that, I have found, is the currency of many nonprofits. That's really what makes them effective, because they have these frontline people, whether they're counselors or teachers or tutors, or working with disadvantaged youth or rape victims, but they know what it's like. And so they don't deal with clients in the sort of linear way that people that haven't experienced this trauma do. They're very open to nuance. They don't judge. They're very resilient. And I would say more than anything, there's actually a competence that I'm trying to define that is embedded in this natural empathy that comes from being the victim of trauma. So I'll stop there because I want to make sure we have time for other presenters and certainly have more time to talk about it in the Q&A if anyone likes. But thank you for listening. And I'm going to turn it over now to Billy Sandberg, who's going to be our next presenter.
All right. Thank you, Tony. That was super interesting. I think that my co-author Robbie and I are hearing a lot of echoes in some of the things that you said in the interviews that we conducted as a part of our research as well. I'm going to share my screen with you now at this point, if I can. Let's see. Everybody see that okay? Yeah, great. Okay. So I am going to present for a bit and then turn it over to my co-presenter, Robbie Show, to discuss some work that we have been doing around marketization and meaningfulness with nonprofit workers. So I'll be presenting on behalf first for Robbie and then my wonderful colleague, Andrew Russo, here's Portland State with me. The title of the presentation and the paper that we're ultimately developing out of this is Exploring Gender Dimensions of Meaningful Nonprofit Work in a Neoliberal Era. And it's born out of a long-term project that we've been working on, Robbie and I, in terms of understanding what the effects of a more marketized work environment and marketized work practices are having on nonprofit workers in terms of their understanding of meaningful work and what a meaningful work experience looks like for them. And this is of interest to us because, you know, for a number of different reasons, including our own interests, personal experiences, but also understanding that the nonprofit literature has a long history and tradition of talking about nonprofit work as sort of inherently meaningful work. There's a lot of literature on nonprofit work that talks about, you know, the motivations that people have to go into nonprofit work around altruism and pro-social motivations and callings to being a part of something greater than oneself and those kinds of things. And I saw Heather Carpenter here, you've written on this topic as well. And we were curious and wanted to understand, you know, what is the experience like when you have these folks who have these pro-social motivations who go into nonprofit work because they want to be a part of something greater than themselves? What happens when they experience a work environment and workplace practices that are increasingly operating and looking like for-profit businesses and operating according more to market-like values? You know, what is that experience like for people when they go into those work environments, and how does that impact and influence their understanding of meaningful work and what that meaningful work experience looks like for them? And so again, this is a part of a long-term project where a few years ago we interviewed about 45 different people in both the public and nonprofit sectors to talk about these kinds of experiences, ask them about what they find meaningful in their work, what this experience has been like for them in recent years, and understanding what their experience has been like in relation to some particular marketized kinds of practices and how that's really affecting their understanding. And so what we're focusing on here and have been focusing on is the nonprofit folks and understanding what that process is like for them. And what some of our initial research has indicated is that we really can't understand nonprofit work as, you know, as nonprofit workers as simply being motivated by these pro-social motivations and callings to doing something greater, and that when they enter these more marketized kinds of work environments, that they're simply experiencing meaningful work in the same kinds of ways that we expect them to, that we assume that they will be, that what they're actually doing is having what we think is more of a hybridized kind of experience and conception of work, where they still articulate and discuss meaningful work in all the ways that we expect them to in terms of callings and pro-social motivations and wanting to contribute to something greater. But at the same time, what they're doing is through what we call a meaningfulness making process, is that they're also taking on some of these elements of a marketized work environment, which is that they're really beginning to incorporate things like performance management and efficiency and financial rewards, and elements like flexible work elements, these kinds of things that we associate with a more marketized workplace practices. They're beginning to incorporate that into their understanding of meaningful work and beginning to see it as a positive, that marketized work environments actually help to enhance their understanding of meaningful work and contribute to their understanding of what a meaningful work experience actually is. And so this is interesting on a couple of different counts, which is on a practical side of things. It means that we have to have a little bit of a different understanding about what motivates nonprofit workers and what contributes to a meaningful work experience for them. So it has practical implications in terms of how we recruit and manage and supervise these workers and help to retain them, because they're influenced not just by their own values around nonprofit work, but they're also influenced by other things that motivate what we might think motivates people in for-profit businesses, like performance management and professional development and monetary rewards, extrinsic rewards, and those kinds of things. And so it's more of a hybridized kind of conception in terms of how we think about what motivates and contributes to a good work experience for nonprofit workers. On a more conceptual side of things, there is this issue of how we understand how workplaces are becoming marketized. And so we have to understand how it's not just organizations becoming marketized and workplace practices becoming marketized, but how those individual workers are beginning to incorporate these values as well in terms of their own understandings of meaningful work. And this is something we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a background before we talked about this particular project and how we're looking at these data through a different lens at this point, which is trying to understand the influences of marketized workplace practices and meaningful work, specifically with regard to gender. So taking all of these ideas that I just talked about and understanding, like, how do they actually affect nonprofit works in terms of those who identify as male and those who identify as female, and how does it affect them differently? And the reason that we're looking at this in particular is because we understand that, like, contemporary feminist theory contends that this process of marketized influence and becoming more entrepreneurial, which is a hallmark of marketized work environments, is that women are seen as ideal neoliberal subjects. They're seen as ideal marketized subjects because they're already really attuned, because of, especially in Western society, social cultural practices, that they're relentlessly personally dissatisfied and they self-monitor to the nth degree. And that really feeds into marketizing processes, especially within work environments. And so this has been studied in some other work environments, but it's not really been experienced in nonprofit work environments. And we're kind of interested in seeing how this is enhanced by nonprofit workers dedicating themselves to meaningful work environments and being willing to subject themselves to difficult work environments for the sake of the work, right? And how this might play out along gender lines. So we're really interested in understanding how men and women are experiencing marketization differently in increasingly marketized nonprofit work environments. So I'm sure, like many of you, we were hoping this would be a little bit further along than it actually is at this point. So we don't have a lot of data to present to you, but we wanted to present these ideas to you to talk through. And so during the Q&A session, we're happy to take questions and see what ideas that you might have about what we can further explore. But I wanted to turn it over to Robbie at this point so she can talk a little bit through about some of our initial findings and how we went about the process of talking with folks about these things.
Right. Thanks, Billy. So our study is, like she said, is really kind of exploratory in general, and that's why we chose a qualitative approach, trying to apply some field literature from the business psychology and gender and women's studies literature into meaningfulness in the nonprofit sector. So this is we conducted a snowball sample and we have semi-structured interviews. Our participants are slightly more female and Caucasian, but we do kind of have a mix. And what we really saw was to try to get a diversity of age. As you can see, organizational demographics, we have people predominantly human service, but all the other categories we tried to find some representation, not that we can generalize this. in like a quantitative way. But, and then our organizations tend to be, to me, a little bit on the bigger size. And we conducted these interviews across 7 regions in the US. And so, yeah, as you all know, we followed typical methodology approaches of double-blind coding and reconciliation process. So all this is done. And at this point, we've just started going through the data and seeking to make sense of some of our findings. So what we're going to present today is just a couple findings, and I'll pose a question to you at the end, and we'd love to get some feedback. So the next slide is about just generally what we have found. So predominantly, can you click, Billy?
Oh yeah, sorry.
She's enjoying it so much. So what we're trying to do is see if we can unpack things. So one of the things about the meaningfulness in work literature, and there is a small section of literature talking about this in the nonprofit sector, is that public servants and nonprofit servants in general tend to view their work as meaningful because of the relationships that they form. So relationships can be with clients, it can be with their coworkers, it can be, you know, it can be pretty broad. So while both men and women talk a lot about these relationships in the organizational context, women tend to talk about these relationships a little bit more in familiar terms. And that is like, these are my family, these are, you know, the organizational place itself is important in fulfilling some sense of family. And so that is one difference that we're finding, and we hope to kind of maybe unpack that a little bit more. And the second way is impact of work. So the meaningfulness in research literature tells us that organizational mission or the work that you do often drives people's motivation to find work, or how people cope and find work meaningful. So this is where we also found a subtle difference. And again, a lot of these differences are very nuanced, and it depends on the person's context, which I think is interesting as well. But one is that both women and men talk a lot about impact. You know, impact, it's all over there, you know, like R&R, I got an R&R one time and they told me, don't use the word impact, but that's what people are using. So anyway, there you go. So men, what we found was they tend to talk a lot about impact in like the community sense, and societal impact. The work I do is changing systems, it's influencing our community, like in a positive way. Whereas women, while they do talk about impact, seem to focus a lot more on like, yeah, large scale impact, but also about the clients. Now, this could have been a function of women maybe having more frontline relationships, but again, these were all executive directors. So we're kind of assuming there's a lot of crossover with what those types of workplaces look like. But I thought it was interesting that women talk a lot about the clients they're helping. And then finally, again, mission is also like impact. It's something that everyone feels like either they really mean it or they just feel like they have to say how important mission is. I don't know, we can't unpack that. But one of the differences we found, right, is that what we put here is more of men in particular have more of this asset-based mindset, right? And I think this really in particular relates to the calling literature that's starting to come out in public administration that already exists a lot in other fields. And that is, I can bring my talents and abilities to make the world a better place. And so men often use that kind of, you know, they don't use the word calling, but they talk about how their talents and treasures makes a difference, and they connect that more so than what we've seen so far in the literature or in our data on women. So on the other side, right, women really focus a lot about this flexibility. And one of the things we definitely are going to have to kind of figure out is that flexibility important, because a lot of these women talk about family and childcare and being able to leave work early, come into work early, work on the weekends to make up hours because they went to their kids' play, things like that, that we didn't find so much among the men in our discussion. And then finally, this idea that women it seems like they have a harder time unpacking their identity from their work. Like they are their work, and that consumes them, and that is very important. And so when they think about their work, just the way the language they use about their work, it's like an extension of themselves. And so there isn't kind of this separation between the two. So our last slide is questions, but one thing I would love to pose to the audience is maybe a little bit more about how to unpack this idea of women potentially being the idealized neoliberal subject. And that is, we just naturally kind of do the things that the literature says a neoliberal subject would do, and potentially more, by we, I mean women, potentially more than men, and kind of what are the implications of that type of framing in your work when it comes to creating meaningfulness. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Billy and Robbie. And now we'll go to Aaron Nelson for our final presentation.
All right. Everybody see? Okay, I like how that's the default question after we put up a PowerPoint. So thank you for joining us. It's great to be with you, but weird to be with you virtually. I certainly miss the hallway conversations. So my co-authors and I are exploring career choices in grant making organizations and basically looking at whether or not this is a matter of, just happy accident that we end up in philanthropy, or whether or not we're making intentional choices to become philanthropy professionals. So really, we don't have a whole lot of literature on those who are working in philanthropic institutions, foundations, and the like. We do have some information on what's going on in terms of career decision-making in the nonprofit sector among charitable organizations, but still not a lot. And so this research is really going to be looking at career decision-making for philanthropy professionals specifically. We housed our work in happenstance learning theory, which is part of career decision-making theory. And basically what that says, the reason we chose this theory is because it provides an element of chance as part of our career decision-making. So it's housed in social learning theory, meaning we, who we are, where we're raised, who we're raised by, and the different contexts of our growing up really does influence not only what we perceive to be a good idea or fun, but also the things we're exposed to. It matters if I'm male or female. May not be suggested for me to be a motorcycle mechanic because I am female versus, if I work in a urban, or if I grew up in an urban or rural area, the different types of opportunities that are presented to me at that point are a little bit different because there may or may not be a lot of nonprofit organizations. And so how I perceive the sector and just different jobs that exist varies. Similarly, if you have kids, you might have read Ada Twist Scientist or Iggy Peck Architect, or you might have played with a Lego construction person. They don't have Foundation CEO Barbie. So, even just in terms of having an awareness that this is a thing that exists when you're younger is not necessarily likely. So we like this element of chance. Basically, we run into something and realize either through an interaction with the person who's doing it, or, oh wait, this is a thing, that it may or may not be a good choice for our career decision-making. So career selection in the nonprofit sector is pretty similar, where, a lot of people just don't know that it exists. And so they're coming into the sector usually by chance or by happy accident. It could be a matter of
organization's main sources of income.
It could be a matter of volunteering. It could be a matter of, just being invited to join an organization that you didn't know was a nonprofit. But in other words, this is kind of a housed in more chance than not. So based on all that, our research questions are really exploratory. Essentially, how do people learn about philanthropic careers? How do they end up in philanthropy as a career? And are there career decision-making differences among job functions? So do, for example, chief financial officers end up in philanthropy differently than chief development officers, differently than program officers, differently than executives? And is it varied among different demographics? So do men and women experience entry into the sector differently? Do different ethnicities and races, is it an age thing? So really looking kind of holistically at how people enter the philanthropic sector. So we collected the email addresses for the chief executive officer, financial officer, program officer, and development officer, or whatever they happen to be called, at the largest 100 community foundations, and sent them an online survey asking about all of these various and sundry things. So we had a total of 547 participants, and these responses are based on 107 actual respondents. So we had about a 20% response rate, which we would have liked to have been better, but COVID happened, so people are a little bit busy right now. The respondents are, disappointingly, but not surprisingly, really white, and they're predominantly female. What was interesting, though, was that 70% of the CEOs are female from our respondent pool. So that's probably not quite directly aligned with reality in the broader sector, but it is, nice to see women. We know that women are, a larger proportion of the workforce. It's just that not necessarily a larger proportion of the executive pool. Also, 60% of the CFOs are male. We found some gender differences that we'll get to in a minute too. So basically, we just started by asking respondents what their familiarity was with the philanthropic sector to begin with. Did you actually know that philanthropy existed as a career option when you were younger? And by and large, no, they did not. About 80% of our respondents said that this was not something that they had any idea of when they were younger. But we have 70% of these respondents saying that they wanted to do something that was a helping career when they were younger. So there's clearly a disconnect between I want to do good. I want, some career where this is making meaning for me, but I don't know exactly how or where to go about doing that. What's interesting though, is among the people that responded, a lot of them do want to stay in philanthropy. So it may be the case where, they're at least finding a way to connect that passion and profession so that we can retain them in the sector, which is good. And this again echoes what we're finding in other studies where people largely don't know that this exists until they're in it. They don't know about it when they're younger. But also the people that are working in the sector did want to help people. There were some interesting differences among the job functions though. There were between 75 to 80% of chief executive officers, development officers, and program officers said that they had always envisioned the career helping people when they were younger. 40% of the CFOs strongly disagreed. They did not want to help people when they were younger. And so this kind of echoes some of the differences that we're finding among the occupations in particular, where the CFOs are a bit of an anomaly. Also, interestingly, 25% of this chief development officers said that they did know that jobs in philanthropy existed when they were younger. So that's a little bit of a difference too. And part of what we're going to be doing, again, these are preliminaries, looking into why this is the case and how they learned about these professions when they were younger. So let's see how they ended up. We first just basically used an open-ended question saying, how did you first become interested in philanthropy? And used the traditional coding, open coding. And really a quarter of them said that they were recruited into philanthropy. So it was more just an accident, not an accident, but a chance event, if you will. There are some people that just said it was straight up an accident. They had no intention of joining the sector and, oh, this was a job ad that I found and turns out it's philanthropy. But interestingly, there was about 20% of the population that were in the nonprofit sector, have only worked in the nonprofit sector and kind of flipped that career on their head. So they were basically going from getting money to giving money. And they really liked that opportunity to flip the switch a little bit on that opportunity. So that was what they said. We also use critical incident technique to determine whether there were, particular critical events that led to their careers, but also what they might be. And about 75% of the respondents said that there was some incident or critical event that actually led them to their career. And of them, 70% that said it was a personal or professional connection that led them to information about jobs. And this again ties back into that networking, recruiting bit that we saw in the prior question. So, it's more those personal connections that are leading people into the sector. But 61% said it was just a matter of right place, right time. So, this is a thing. Well, I guess we'll do that. So again, that lack of intentionality there. We started digging into the second and third research questions a little bit here too, and noticed that there were significant differences, not between job functions, so there weren't any differences there, but among the races and perceived importance of events. In particular, half of our Black respondents said that a year of service had a great deal of influence on their philanthropic careers, and 83% of Black respondents said that volunteering did. And it was much, much lower percentages for really any of the other races or ethnicities, which granted there is a low end, but that's still something that I think we're going to dig into when we do some follow-up interviews just to see if there's a there there. There was also a significant relationship between gender and the perceived influence of marriage and family. Men actually thought that, or noted that it was more of an influence on their career decision-making, but to that note, one did say that he chose a philanthropy career because one of the people that was working there was cute and he wanted their number. So I don't know, could be that, probably not. There's also a relationship between generations and the perceived influence of previous work or social experience, but that's just a matter of probably having a larger network because you've been on the planet a little bit longer. So we asked them also to kind of highlight what these unplanned critical events were. And again, largely we're seeing a lot of people that were recruited into the sector, but also that indicated mentorship and networking had an influence. And they're separately coded, but they always kind of coincided together. So it was somebody in the sector either pulled me in or I knew somebody in the sector who was working in and saw them. But also there was relocation volunteering. A lot of people relocated. It was usually a trailing spouse situation, or it usually coincided with something else like personal or health related, but they did relocate to enter this career. And then volunteering was also one of those ways that people entered the sector. And it was usually that they were board members for the community foundation and then had an opportunity to join their staff or their workforce. So among executives, really, it's just that connection and chance events that are key to decision-making and sector entry. We do find that CFOs are a little bit of an outlier in terms of general awareness and their points of entry, although there is that blip with the chief development officers that we're going to be looking at. And then there were a few demographic differences among respondents. We are still in the process of going through a lot of the qualitative and coding those to see to align these with the quantitative findings, but that is down the road a little bit. So future directions, we're going to compare the results of executives. We also sent the survey to mid-career and entry-level employees to see if there are differences there. I would hypothesize likely there are, just because the executive levels tend to be recruited, whereas it could be the case that those lower in their career trajectory or less farther along in their career trajectory or entering differently. We're also going to be looking a little bit more intentionally at the relationships between demographics and career decisions through follow-up interviews, talking to some of these people, not only the more common representative examples, but some of the outliers, just to see kind of what's going on with these particular populations. So that is that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Erin, for your wonderful presentation. So now we'll open it up. Anyone has any questions that you'd like to ask to any of the presenters or to all of the presenters, however, please feel free. Okay, yeah, you're welcome to use the chat or to verbalize your questions. I think, do we have this set so everyone can speak, right? Let's see. Okay, let me know by chat if you can't, but you should be able to. Okay, so I see a question. How can nonprofit leadership, this is directed toward me, how can nonprofit leadership help facilitate the growth factor of this to ensure people are well taken care of and can develop new skills and avoid just trauma? Okay. Well, so this is, this is kind of controversial, but I don't think people can really avoid trauma. I think trauma, I see trauma as an emotion, and just like you can't avoid sadness or insecurity, or, I mean, we all feel all of these various emotions. I would say that the more someone has a sort of a growth orientation, the less trauma they are likely to experience. But I've been reading these the books by Tedeschi and Calhoun, the founders of this whole concept of post-traumatic growth, and they don't see the experience of trauma and post-traumatic growth to influence each other. So in other words, some people may experience a lot of trauma and also a lot of post-traumatic growth. So it's not that there's not a relationship that's been discovered in their research of someone, for example, experiences post-traumatic growth, so then that is correlated to low levels of trauma. There's nothing like that that's been found. So I think to cultivate this, though, what I would recommend for nonprofit leaders, and what I'm seeing from the, from the research that I'm doing, is, one of the major problems in nonprofits is that we become very transactional because we're trying to do so much with so little resources. And I think here's where there's an entry point for transformational leadership and other relationship-oriented theories of leadership, like servant leadership and leader-member exchange, authentic leadership, where whichever way you want to describe it, essentially leaders creating meaning-making opportunities for staff and volunteers, and that means being able to facilitate a process where people can step off of the stage and onto the balcony and reflect on their work. And then I think there can be some questions that are asked there by the leader or by an external person or another someone else in the organization, but really like letting people share what they're experiencing. Alicia Grandy has a wonderful paper about creating a climate of authenticity. And so creating this kind of climate where, but understanding that when people just vent about the trauma they're experiencing, there's a lot of the social psychological research doesn't really support that that's beneficial if you're just complaining. And I think this is why a lot of nonprofit leaders try to steer clear of sort of facilitating secondary trauma oriented conversations, because they don't want it to turn into this kind of like session of just everyone just kind of belching out all the negative emotions they're feeling and all the events that they're experiencing and complaining about the clients and about what they have to do. And I think it's a big concern for these nonprofit leaders because they want to also coordinate and move and have people move forward toward the nonprofit's objectives and goals. So I think it has to be very carefully moderated, but it does need to be done. And I don't think it's just something that can be outsourced. This is very common to say, okay, you're having psychological difficulties, let's send you out to a therapist. And then not much is done within the organization. It's kind of, and it also creates a feeling like, okay, if I'm having trouble, I got to go outside to process it as opposed to within the organization. So I don't think that's a bad thing to do, but I think it needs to be complemented with leaders kind of upping their game around their leader emotion management strategies and being able to kind of help others to work through it. So just simply asking people, for example, at the beginning of a staff meeting, so let's all go around the table and just share, like, why are you here? Like, why did you come through these doors today? Like, what motivates you in your work? Getting people to go, kind of dovetailing with Billy and Robbie and Andrew's research on like coming, bringing people to purpose. Like this is what kind of getting a sense like, okay, this is the meaning in what I do. Okay, so we have a question for Billy and Robbie, which is, could you talk more about the feminization of nonprofit work? And well, I guess you guys can read it in the chat, but Billy and Robbie, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, thanks for the question, Maureen. Can you talk more about the feminization of nonprofit work? I'm curious if your subjects recognize the gendered patterns in their organizations and the sectors and the ways that feminized work is undervalued in all ways. So I would say, first of all, we didn't ask this question very specifically. And so I would say that, we didn't elicit that information. And so that's not something that our respondents really spoke to. I would say that there was one woman who absolutely recognized the work environment in which she was working, because one of the questions that we did ask them was things that really detracted from and distracted them from having a meaningful work experience in their organizations. And there was one woman in particular who talked about the gendered work environment, in particular being a huge detractor to her work experience. And she talked in great detail about that. And it was not so much around compensation, but it was more around basically being, even though she was in a leadership position, being relegated to doing quote unquote feminized work, the typical scenario of being asked to take the minutes and, that kind of stuff in meetings. And so that was very much a part of her experience. But in general, I think one of the things that we noticed is that when we were talking to folks about these more marketized kinds of work environments and workplace practices that there were very few respondents who actually talked about them very consciously in terms of how they actually affected their day-to-day work experience. That when we asked them to reflect on these things, they could talk about them obviously very cogently, but there wasn't necessarily a consciousness around how it was affecting them in terms of their larger experience of nonprofit work. It was just, it was more like maybe this is having a detrimental effect on me, you know, as an individual, and maybe this is having a detrimental effect on our organizations. There was very little consciousness around any of those things, which I think is interesting in and of itself. Robbie, do you want to speak to that?
I do want to add something. You know, it's funny, Tony, we have another paper that hopefully is going to work out under revise and resubmit, but we're talking about the meaningfulness making process. And what we're finding is no matter how bad things are, even if the work environment sucks, your boss sucks, your work, you know, you're unhappy, people go out of their way to find meaning in their work, like to create positive social order. And so, Tony, when thinking about your presentation, even when you experience trauma, there's something about human nature that pushes most people to try to cope with it by making sense and making positive sense and connecting it to meaningfulness. And so I don't know, Billy, maybe this is something Maureen's question is spurring me to think about, but can we somehow connect that? Do women take distraction and turn it positive in a different way than men? We haven't thought about that question, but it's something we should maybe continue to explore. And if our hypothesis is correct, then maybe women tend to do this more quickly or more easily, or just the way they narrate these things that take away from their job may look differently. So thanks for kind of spurring that question and helping us think about another way of framing the study. Mm-hmm. And or connecting with Tony's work. I don't know how, but.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, Robbie, because you know, there's Rumi once wrote that the wound is where the light enters you, and I think sometimes when everything is kind of going well for us, we just kind of coast along, and I have another paper about that, how we kind of feel this diffuse contentment, but it doesn't tend to engender like direct action, you know, and so I'm also doing a study on loneliness in nonprofits, and one of the findings is that one of the sources or antecedents of loneliness is this need for contribution, this need to feel like you're making a difference, especially at higher status roles in nonprofits where we see that more, whereas with lower status roles, you don't see it as much. You see more of the sort of need for emotional connection with others. And when that need is unsatisfied, it leads to loneliness. But especially with the people in leadership roles in nonprofits, there's this sense that if they feel that their need to contribute is being stifled, they feel lonely. And I've seen that with both men and women. Of course, you know, most of the people I interview are women because most people working in nonprofits are women. But it'd be interesting to see what the gender differences are there. I think there's another question, Billy, Robbie, and Andrew, for you from Jody there.
So Jody, thanks for your question. Out of curiosity, how might formal job benefits such as remote work options, salary, or public policies within workplace settings with regard to FMLA, paid leave, influence perceptions around the flexibility and or meaningfulness in the workplace based on gender? That's a really good question, Jody. It's not something that we actually formally explored because we only interviewed one person at each organization. So we didn't dig deep into the organizational culture and structure for each organization. It's something that we've been thinking about in terms of next steps of maybe doing a case study organization to explore the relationship between organizational culture, policy, leadership, and how that influences marketized workplace practices and then this meaningful work experience. But I would say that one of the interesting things that we did find in our initial run through the interview data is that there's an idea about what flexibilization means in the marketized literature, which is that it's very much about organizations taking on practices like right sizing and downsizing and contingent workplace practices like moving people into part-time work and contingent work and contracting and those kinds of things. And we definitely saw, especially the emphasis on contracting in the organizations, but for the respondents in our organizations, what they talked about when we talked about flexible workplace arrangement was much more around the kinds of things that you're talking about, which is comp time, flex time, flexible work arrangements, working, teleworking, and all of those kinds of things as being much more salient to their own personal experience with regard to flexibilization. And so for us, that was a really interesting finding that we weren't looking for, which is that in nonprofit work settings, this idea of flexibilization actually looks different conceptually, like the actual practice of it is different. And so I think that that's absolutely something to explore in terms of it's one of these things where it's considered a marketized practice, but it has both these positive and and negative benefits for people, which is that, like, it contributes to them working all the time, right? That contributes to this idea that there's no barriers between your professional life and your personal life, because you can be working all the time because you have this flexibility. But at the same time, a lot of the respondents viewed it very positively because it did give them flexibility to take care of their kids and to do other things in their life. And so that's what we're seeing is that these marketized work environments, it's both positive and negative. It's not just one thing or the other. Robbie, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm going to add some of the comments to the chat that's going on, Billy, while you were talking. And this idea that, and some things we probably still need to unpack. We wish we would have had more, a more diverse sample, right? To get into some of the issues about race and how this intersects. But and even this question about microaggressions and what that looks like, I find that so fascinating. And Billy and I are trying to figure out next steps. But Heather, you asked this question about differences based on organizational type. And so while we don't have a large group of respondents, we do have a few that are more in advocacy type or activism work. And we do find differences in how they talk about their work in particular. And one of the ideas is that it's more inherent to their identity in some ways. Maybe they've been affected by the type of work they're doing, right? And so they see a greater responsibility to respond to the community and to address, particularly one organization like racial injustice around immigrant communities and how they're treated. And so I think while we can't say too much about that, we are finding the way they talk about meaningfulness is subtly different. I just wish we had more people that we had asked these questions of, but I think there's something to that as well. So I appreciate those comments, and more, it just leads me to think about all the other questions we need to ask when we redo this, including having more frontline workers, to Tony's point, like frontline staff versus management. We think we're probably getting a different perspective on these issues.
Yeah, I have a comment also on this issue about race and trauma, but first, I have a question for Erin. Erin, I wanted to ask you, so I really found this fascinating about how you saw that, like, the role of social cognition in nonprofit career choice, and how does that play out, especially when you're in an environment where very few people around you are choosing nonprofit careers? So how do you see that social learning or social cognition kind of elaborates this whole process of choosing a nonprofit career?
So again, these are very preliminary results, but what we're seeing is that it's people from different sectors who don't know about philanthropy, and they're being pulled in by mentors who make a career transition ahead of them. And so in this case, it would be, I saw them go into the sector. I saw them enjoying what they do, having, making an impact, sorry, Robbie, making an impact in the community, really enjoying the type of work that they're doing. And so that seems like a good idea for me too. And that's kind of the learning piece is in the nonprofit sector specifically, it was more, I saw the work at hand and I can see myself in that role. But in this case, it's more, I've seen mentors who, seem to enjoy it. It's not necessarily the function itself, it's the happiness that it brings them, or the joy that it brings them behind the work.
And thank you, Erin. Well, I'll share that in addition to doing this study of secondary trauma in nonprofits, I'm leading a national study of police departments. Police also experience a lot of trauma, secondary trauma, as you can imagine. And I remember in Savannah doing a focus group with about 15 frontline first level responders. And there was an African-American woman there. And this was very common with the nonprofit and the police interviews, that people of color experience, like racism is very interwoven into their experiences of trauma. So, she was recounting a story of going out on a call to a rural citizen outside Savannah, and white male, about 83 years old, and he comes out of the door with a rifle in his hand and says, I'm not gonna have an N-word, B-word help me. Help us with this problem. Send someone else. And so those kinds of, the thing about trauma is that it's really an amalgam of many emotions, from disillusionment, disappointment, just concern. Like if you think about about the George Floyd murder, I mean, we as a nation were quarantined, collectively observing a man being killed for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I mean, that was this collective trauma that's been very interwoven and sort of embedded in racism. Anyway, it's a big issue, and I think we're just at the just starting to make very small gains in understanding this. So I think it's something that really needs more research. I have a question also for Robbie and Billy, Andrew. So you found that this sort of gender effects emerging, where men tend to speak more about meaning and purpose, and women tend to respond more with flexibility. Can you say more about that, and what do you attribute that to?
Well, I don't know that we're ready to attribute it to anything just yet.
Nice, Billy, nice.
No, I mean, when I say that we're behind in our data analysis, we're really behind. So these are just like preliminary thoughts and very preliminary kinds of findings. I mean, I think that, the first sweep that we've done through the data in terms of really seeing how people who identify as men versus people who identify as women, there's subtle nuances just in terms of their understandings of what is meaningful to them. And so the initial pass through is understanding that there are subtle differences in terms of what they find meaningful about the work in and of itself. And then there are subtle differences around like organizational culture, which they also find meaningful, and which helps to facilitate their understanding of meaningful work and their experience of meaningful work. And so I think to some extent there's these subtle differences between how men versus women sort of see themselves in the organization and what their purpose is within the organization, and then how they respond to different cues from organizational culture that help to either enhance or detract from their own meaningful experience of meaningfulness. And flexible work environments is something that women spoke about much more than men did. We have to dig that. I mean, I can only add some conjecture to that, which is that, in our society, women are still the primary caregivers in their homes. And so for a lot of these women, they had children, they had other obligations, they were, did a lot more community-based work, I think, than some of the men that we interviewed. And so if they're seen as those primary caregivers and community workers, then they obviously see flexible work arrangements as enhancing their experience of work rather than detracting from it. And so, but that's just conjecture at this point.
Thank you. And I know we're not giving you guys much room to breathe here, but I don't know if you also, Robbie or Billy, like to we have a question from Maureen. I don't know if you feel like you've already answered that, or if you want about boundaries around work under neoliberalism.
I think that's definitely what we want to be able to unpack a little better. I find it may actually show up more when we have these questions on how do you cope with work and what detracts from your work. I think that's where we're going to find the differences on the more, I hate to say negative aspects, but the part of work that they feel like actually takes away from what they find meaningful. I don't know, Billy. So I think that that's definitely going to show up, and maybe it's going to show up, maybe it won't be a difference too. Maybe everyone feels that way right now in nonprofit work, because ultimately it is about impact, mission, and while they talk about impact maybe a little bit differently, they also are driven by the same relationship. I want to help people in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that, I mean, the critical management literature really talks about the fact that organizations that are marketized really rely on this idea of people bringing their whole selves to work, right? Like everything about you. It's not just your experience and your skills and your education, but it's also like your values and your emotions and, you know, all this stuff, like you're bringing your whole self to work, and it's really required to make this organization go at this particular point. And I think that, you know, across the data, we see that with both men and women, like they're both experiencing, like I can think of an interview off the top of my head where he worked for an environmental organization that helped to promote trail reconstruction and, you know, mountaineering and those kinds of things. And he would talk about like going out mountaineering on, you know, himself, like climbing, and like people asking him questions. He's like, oh my God, I have all this expertise that I could give to this person, but I don't want to talk to you right now. Like I want to do my own thing right now, you know, but feeling compelled is like, I should share my experience. I should be like on right now and working because it would be good for the organization, but I don't want to because I want to be by myself, but I feel compelled to. And so people like talking through these experiences of feeling compelled to be on and at work all the time. And I think that that's pretty consistent across both men and women. And so I think for us, it'll be curious to see like what the nuances are between those experiences. You know, if there are some real differences between women and men in terms of how they experience that.
Excellent. Thank you, Billy and Robbie, and also Erin. And I guess we're at the end of our session, but thanks everyone for your wonderful questions and participation. And we'll see you around at the other Arnova sessions.